Mr. President, could you repeat the... No, Mr. President.
Kasi kondo mong sagot eh.
Well, the
Why
condoms...
not?
Yes, Mr. President. Of course, abstinence is also in our menu of responses to prevent unplanned pregnancies, certainly to prevent sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV and AIDS. But the subgroup of people living with HIV and AIDS who are accounted for by pregnant women were already infected with HIV prior to becoming pregnant, and therefore the virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, was transmitted to their babies while in the uterus, not because of sexual intercourse while they were pregnant, and then the baby was infected, and which, by the way, is not contemplated as an indecent act anyway.
Okay, going
Mr.
to the
President.
second factor that you mentioned, no?
Yes, Mr. President.
Below 24, malaking percentage. 25 up, nabawasan na. And older, nabawasan na. It seems that the older they get, the less adventurous they become. At medyo nag-iisip na siguro. So, below 24 yung danger. Now, in the law, in 8504, is there no emphasis on the information campaign?
There is, Mr. President. And if I may share some thoughts on what the good gentleman has noticed about the shifting in the percentages, perhaps it's I wouldn't want to presume that the sex life of people approaching senior citizenship is any less active than younger people. But I suppose the small percentage of 3% for persons 50 years old and above might be accounted for by the sad fact that since the HIV epidemic began in the Philippines, or was first detected in the 1980s, no? In the 1980s, this was a time that there was still no Philippine HIV and AIDS law. That is why it was warmly welcomed by the health community when it was passed into law. But earlier, Filipinos who were infected perhaps were among the greater number who did not receive the benefit of early detection, early treatment, and most probably suffered the greatest number of deaths from this illness. Yes, Mr. President. For example,
yes.
if we look at the deaths from the whole period of January 1984 to March 2017, the total is 2,124. Well, if we look at the 3 months of January to March 2017, it's 155. So perhaps we are seeing younger sections of the population still alive, living with HIV or AIDS, hopefully receiving treatment, because hopefully their illness was detected and started to be treated at a younger age, Mr. President.
Perhaps. All right. We will accept that. Now, are there any other factors for the ineffectiveness, say, or the less than 50% effectiveness of 8504?
For example, Mr. President, perhaps one factor is also the late introduction of a health strategy that thankfully, belatedly, has been supported by the Dangerous Drugs Board and is contemplated to be implemented by the Department of Health for persons living with HIV and AIDS, and this is none other than harm reduction, which are evidence-based policies, programs, and approaches that aim to reduce transmission of HIV and its harmful consequences on health, social relations, and economic conditions. Harm reduction could, in fact, include what are contemplated in this bill, such as prohibiting, so this bill contemplates, Mr. President, looks forward to the continued support and implementation by the DDB and the DOH of harm reduction for persons living with HIV and AIDS. there's also the additional factor, Mr. President, of voluntary HIV testing and counseling. It means that people being tested for HIV must not be coerced by individuals or institutions into taking an HIV test. It has been reported by the health community, Mr. President, that in earlier years there seems to have been some difficulty with mandatory HIV testing, which rather than increasing the test-seeking behavior of persons who are vulnerable to HIV infection and therefore would probably more need to know their HIV status so that if HIV positive, they can seek early intervention and treatment, would have the opposite effect of scaring them away from going in for what should be voluntary HIV testing and HIV counseling. So mandatory testing has served as a brake on, ironically, has served as a brake on the full and beneficial implementation of the current HIV and AIDS law, Mr. President.
I was supposed to go to at a later time on one of your strategies, but you mentioned it as perhaps a factor, while it is less than 50% effective, yung no health strategy, and then you go to mention that the health strategy you're talking about is the harm reduction strategy. It just, I hope you don't mind, but I suddenly was, my antennas suddenly went up when I heard that harm reduction strategy. I hope you are not pertaining to the harm reduction strategy that I fought in the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in 2008. They were introducing a harm reduction strategy program that will give free syringes to drug dependents or drug addicts of heroin so that it will prevent them from getting AIDS from the others. And they were introducing it in the UN conference. I objected, and we debated in a roundtable discussion. The United States and the Russian representatives agreed with me, and the entire Asian contingent supported me, and we were debating with representatives from Sweden, Switzerland, Netherlands, Norway, I think another 2 or 3 more European countries who were introducing that. And as a matter of fact, I said, if you have enough money to give syringes to your drug addicts, in the Philippines, we are very poor. Just give us the money so that we can give it to the poor people. We have people who go hungry every day. So why will you spend money on syringes for drug addicts? That was the issue that we brought up. I hope this is not the same harm reduction strategy you're talking about. Because otherwise, I will definitely object, Mr. President. I was about to take this up because I think it's part of your bill. But now that you mention it, may we be enlightened on what you mean by, in the past there was no health strategy, and now you are introducing a harm reduction strategy. What strategy is your harm reduction strategy, Mr. President?
Mr. President, to clarify, I did not say there was no health strategy. In fact, the first comprehensive health strategy for our country to address HIV and AIDS is embodied in the current HIV and AIDS law. And harm reduction is contemplated as an additional component in the bill. And yes, I confirm to the good gentleman that there is no needle and syringe program contemplated for the purposes of this bill. To repeat, harm reduction in this bill refers to evidence-based policies, programs, and approaches that aim to reduce transmission of HIV and its harmful consequences on health, social relations, and economic conditions. Just to further expand on what the on what the aims of this bill are. One is to reform the Philippine National AIDS Council as the main governance platform for the HIV response to guarantee efficiency and alignment with evidence-based approaches to address the HIV epidemic. Second is to establish a national HIV program with clear mechanisms for operationalization and implementation at the local level. Third is to introduce evidence-based, human rights-informed, and gender-transformative HIV prevention and treatment approaches. Fourth is to improve access to HIV services, especially for key populations and vulnerable communities, and ensure social and financial risk protection for those who need to access these services. Fifth is to enhance anti-discrimination protection to promote the human rights of Filipinos living with HIV, key populations and vulnerable communities, and providers of HIV services. Sixth is to promote a more collaborative framework for the HIV response, especially to guarantee the meaningful participation and involvement of civil society, communities, and key populations. And lastly, Mr. President, to guarantee sufficient investment for the HIV response. So these all, Mr. President, constitute the health strategy vis-a-vis HIV and AIDS as enhancing or building upon the current Philippine HIV and AIDS law.
Well, Mr. President, if what you just read is incorporated in Section 23, I will have no qualms, Mr. President, but your Section 23 sounds different. Harm reduction strategies. The DILG and the DOH, in close coordination with the Dangerous Drugs Board and in partnership with the key affected populations, shall establish a human rights and evidence-based HIV prevention policy and program for people who use and inject drugs. Parang pasok na pasok ito sa sinasabi ko na problema, Mr. President. The presence of used or unused condoms, other safer sex paraphernalia, and sterile injecting equipment shall not be used as basis to conduct raids or similar police operations in sites and venues of HIV prevention interventions. I'm suddenly reminded of a program of the DOH which I stopped in Cebu. They were starting to do the harm reduction strategy already in Cebu. And Assistant Secretary Tayag was convincing me about it, and I said, no, we will not allow it. And this is exactly the content of Section 23. If what you read is Section 23, you have no objection from me. But this is, your Section 23 is a very different wordings as what you have explained on your harm reduction strategy. So perhaps we can probably take a step back and study this. As a matter of fact, I will suggest that we change the title of the section, because in the international community, a harm reduction strategy is giving away syringes to heroin addicts. That is the definition, in so many words, Mr. President. So perhaps, well, may I be given a copy of the statements that was just made by the distinguished lady from Akbayan, so that we can study and how we will be able to incorporate it in Section 23, Mr. President.
Mr. President, to reiterate, harm reduction refers to evidence-based policies, programs, and approaches that aim to reduce transmission of HIV and its harmful consequences on health, social relations, and economic conditions. So it is a broad menu of possible interventions, Mr. President, that fall under the rubric of harm reduction. And it is up to each country to select whether to adopt all or to select which some of these strategies to incorporate into their health strategy to address the needs and situations of people living with HIV and AIDS. And I would like to note, Mr. President, for the reassurance of the good gentleman that in a committee hearing on this bill, the Dangerous Drugs Board itself already agreed that harm reduction, as broadly defined, as I have reiterated earlier, DDB agreed that harm reduction is a part of the health response or the overall health strategy to stop HIV transmission, even among people persons who inject drugs. So even if the Philippines chooses to maintain not providing needle and syringe programs, there is still a wide array of harm reduction interventions that can be considered in the whole menu, and that can be placed in the law of an enhanced HIV and AIDS law or response, so as to prevent the further transmission of HIV among persons who inject drugs.
May I know when the DDB agreed to support this particular program or strategy?
Yes, Mr. President. That was the hearing conducted by the committee on November 29, 2016.
November 29, 2016. And the
Yes,
Dangerous
Mr.
Drugs Board
President.
chair then was?
The resource person, Mr. President, was Mr. Adeva. I can get the complete name.
Well, I wish you talk to the Dangerous Drugs Board chair now, Dr. Benji Reyes, and the executive director of the Dangerous Drugs Board now, as Under Secretary Leng Matibag. Let us hear their comments instead of the person that you mentioned, because I know these two persons will not agree.
I would be very glad to do that, Mr. President, and I'm quite confident to come back to the good gentleman with the confirmation of these two gentlemen that their board supports harm reduction as one of the components of our HIV and AIDS strategy. And in fact, in any case, Mr. President, I would leave it to the Department of Health as to what program or programs it will implement for persons who inject drugs who are suffering from HIV.
I have no problem with people injecting drugs, except injecting illegal drugs, Mr. President. That is my problem. So I hope you don't mind, but I will suspend my interpellation in that case. I have barely started with page one, but with my page one. But I really would want to hear from the Dangerous Drugs Board first, the present Dangerous Drugs Board, and not one of those officers there that were sent to attend the hearing. So in the meantime, I suspend my interpellation, Mr. President, and I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1390 under Committee Report 52, Mr. President.
Is there any objection?
Just one last point, Mr.
Yes,
President, not
Senator
objecting,
Guerrero.
but just making one last point at this point in the interpellation, that I have noted that, in fact, Sir Reyes, the head of the Dangerous Drugs Board, Dr. Reyes, expressed support for harm reduction at the recent conference on... Did he express support? Did he express support? He expressed support at the International Harm Reduction Conference recently held here in the Philippines, Mr. President. But I shall get back to the good gentleman on even more more updated response from the two gentlemen of the Dangerous Drugs Board, so that we can continue his interpellation on harm reduction and other aspects of the bill, but also in particular on harm reduction, in order to reassure him about in the precise way in which DDB has, as I said earlier, supported harm reduction, and that we contemplate the DOH implementing it in close coordination with the board. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
President.
you, Senator
Thank you,
Hontiveros.
gentlemen.